British Florida would start off with a bang. The British would use the 7 Years' War as a means to make a deal with the Spanish. The British would siege and capture Spanish-owned Havana, Cuba. And in order for the Spanish to regain control over Cuba, the British would ask for the territory of Florida in exchange. And at the end of the war in 1763, with one signature, Great Britain had gained the territory of Florida.
Although the British rule would last only for 2 decades, its ramifications would be lasting. With the new British occupation, nearly all of the Spanish population left for Cuba, along with them also the natives from where they lived, especially the St. Augustine region. The British would soon divide the massive territory in an attempt for easier management. They would divide it into East and West Florida, the western part engulfing nearly all of the peninsula except for the Panhandle. With the territory lacking a substantial population, the British would give land grants to officers who had served in the French and Indian War. New settlers would also move down from the northern British colonies, especially from Georgia and South Carolina. Unsurprisingly, a majority settled along the northeastern coast.
These settlers, mainly poor white Southerners, would be the first of the Florida Crackers, or the Cracker Cowboys. Loaded name, I know, but back in the day, it was not an insult. The name Cracker would be used for these cowmen because instead of using lassos to herd cattle like the Western cowboys, they would use the loud cracker of their whips to herd the wild cows in the Florida backwoods. The wild cracker cows were incredibly adapted to their environment, descendants of the cows brought by the conquistadors centuries ago. In fact, this is the case for the wild boar, chickens, and orange groves that were used by those frontiersmen, and still continue to be an important part of Florida agriculture. All of these livestock and crops would be the legacies of those early Spanish settlers, and would eventually find their way onto your plate as the all-American breakfast grand slam at your local breakfast diner chain restaurant.
In 1768, Scottish Parliament member Andrew Turnbull attempts to make a Greek colony in Florida. What Florida history has taught us anything is that when a plan is made, things gonna go in the opposite direction. He originally planned the settlement to be Greek in character in honor of his wife and would name it New Smyrna in honor of her birthplace. But when reaching Greece, it was controlled by the Turks, so the majority of the servants would be recruited from Minorca, Spain. On arrival, the indentured servants would suffer greatly under Turnbull, not only due to disease, pests, and native attacks, but also due to the harsh punishments of Turnbull. But the Minorcans had at least one thing which gave them hope. The priest that had been sent with them, Father Pedro Camps. The settlers would be the only Catholics in the peninsula at the time, and suffering with no help in sight. In 1777, the Minorcans would make their historic long march to St. Augustine. Due to the terrible harvest yielded from crops, the settlements would be abandoned, and the Minorcans who had escaped would resettle in St. Augustine. Father Camps would be the last one to leave, caring for the most sick and weakly among the settlers. Father Camps would eventually be able to relocate to St. Augustine, but he would die prematurely in 1790, never being able to return home after his many years of arduous service. Thanks to the sacrifices made by Father Pedro Camps and the Minorcan settlers, the Catholic faith was able to survive in Florida. And a monument to Father Pedro Camps and his Minorcan parishioners still stands in the courtyard of the Cathedral of St. Augustine, commemorating their faith and the sacrifices made for their people. But while the British attempted to solidify their hold on Florida, in the north, sparks of revolution would begin to flame. And Florida would participate in the Revolutionary War, but on the Royalist side. Due to the physical and cultural isolation from other British American colonies, both East and West Florida would refuse the Founding Fathers' offer to attend the Continental Congress. Also, due to the new population, many were more identified with Great Britain than the American war effort. Of course, the rival powers of France and Spain would see a great opportunity to capitalize in the Revolutionary War effort. They could weaken the British colonial empire by participating. Spain saw a chance to regain the territories that it had ceded to the English previously, and begin to give military aid to the Americans. And in 1779, Spain would formally declare war on Great Britain, and join the French in aiding the Americans in their war for independence. While the French would aid in the northeast, George Washington would employ the help of Bernardo de Gálvez, the governor of Spanish Louisiana. He would be incredibly useful in the Mississippi theater, and he would shut down the port of New Orleans to cut off the British reinforcements from the Caribbean into the Delta. This freed up not only the port of New Orleans, but also the entire Mississippi River to aid the Americans.
Gálvez had been a masterful strategist and decisively captured the westernmost British outpost in West Florida, defeating the British Loyalist forces in Fort Butte, Baton Rouge, and Natchez. He had successfully freed the Mississippi Delta and prevented a successful British offensive into New Orleans. But to win, he had to capture the capital of West Florida, Pensacola. On March 1781, all forces would converge at Pensacola, Spanish troops from Mobile, Louisiana, and Cuba. But on March 9th, the leader of the fleet, Captain Calvo, got cold feet. Upon first seeing Pensacola Bay, he didn't want to risk grounding his fleet in the shallow waters of the bay, or risk the British artillery fire. After 9 days of a standstill full of arguments, on March 18th, Gálvez boarded the ship Galveztown, and he alone sailed into the bay, avoiding the British fire. His brave and daring move not only broke the standstill, but inspired courage in all his men. The fleet would follow his lead and follow into the bay and disembark, and the siege would go on for 2 brutal months. Disaster struck when a hurricane hit on May 5th, forcing the ships to return. The men there kept up the charge, and on May 8th, the Spanish shot a bullseye. A shell from their cannons hit the magazine at Fort Crescent, causing a massive explosion. With only a couple forts left and their days numbered, 2 days later, a white flag of surrender would be raised by the British forces. Gálvez would personally accept the surrender, and with that, West Florida was back in Spanish hands, and the siege of Pensacola was complete.
With the war over and the British defeated, they gave the American rebels their independence, and much of the North American possessions would be given up. In 1783, this Treaty of Paris would be signed. Spain would leave the peace agreement with the biggest extent of their empire that had ever been seen.
After the war, Gálvez would be called before the King of Spain, Carlos III. In honor of his brave feats and his reconquest of Florida, the king would grant him a great honor. On his coat of arms, he would have permission to place the words, Yo solo, I alone. In honor of the heroism he showed when he alone had the courage to enter Pensacola Bay. Gálvez would write a poem recounting the war, and would write thus: May the manifestations everlasting remain to astound the world. Why England trembles because her ships fall before the Spanish flag, that she surrenders her pride and punish her arrogance, watching a severe God, desires that she return to his church, desires that she embrace the faith.
Having regained Florida and in possession of Louisiana, they had to protect their claims. This meant protecting their borders and trade deals. As such, high tariffs would be placed on the American goods, and settler access would be extremely limited. But the events that would follow would rock the fate of Florida forever.
Thanks for watching. Tune in for part 3 for more to find out about how Florida got annexed into the United States. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support on Patreon for more. Shout out to my first ever patron, Anna. Really appreciate it. I hope to see more patrons soon, and thank you so much for watching.